What happened to medieval executioners after the beheadings were over? Hey guys, tonight we begin with a profession that absolutely nobody wanted to sit next to at dinner. A profession that was feared, avoided, whispered about, and occasionally paid surprisingly well. Tonight we're talking about medieval executioners. More specifically, we're asking a strangely comforting question. What happened to medieval executioners after the beheadings were over? Because history tends to focus on the dramatic moment, the execution, the crowd, the condemned noble, the king making questionable life decisions. You know, the usual medieval entertainment package. But very few people stop and ask what happened afterward. What did the executioner do when everyone went home? Did he clock out? Did he wander down to the local tavern? Did he have friends? Could he get married? Did his children tell people what their father did for a living? Or did they suddenly become very interested in changing the subject? So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's spend the evening following one of the most isolated men in medieval society. A man everyone needed, and almost nobody wanted around. Imagine being essential to society while society actively avoids making eye contact with you. That was basically the job description. Now, contrary to what movies often suggest, executioners did not spend every day swinging axes. In fact, most of the time, they weren't executing anyone at all. Medieval towns simply did not produce enough executions to keep a man busy every single day. Even by medieval standards, there were limits. So the average executioner spent much of his life doing other things. Some worked as jailers. Some tortured prisoners during investigations. A sentence that sounds deeply unpleasant no matter how slowly it's narrated. Others removed animal carcasses from roads. Some cleaned sewers. Some handled jobs that everyone else considered disgusting. Which is important to understand. Executioners often became associated with anything considered impure, anything unpleasant, anything involving blood, death, waste, or decay. Because once society decided you were already contaminated by one unpleasant task, apparently it seemed reasonable to assign you all the others as well. It was the medieval version of being volunteered for every undesirable workplace duty. Except instead of cleaning the office microwave, you were removing dead horses from the city gates. A slightly different scale of inconvenience. Now let's imagine a typical day. The execution is over, the crowd has dispersed, the condemned individual has unfortunately stopped participating in future events, and the executioner is left standing there. What happens next? Well, first of all, somebody had to clean up. History books rarely mention this, because historians, much like everyone else, generally prefer talking about kings. But executions created practical problems. Equipment needed maintenance. Scaffolds needed dismantling. Bodies needed handling. Everything required organization. And much of that responsibility landed on the executioner. There was no medieval cleanup crew waiting nearby. No municipal department arriving with clipboards. The executioner handled it. Then he went home. Which sounds simple, until you realize home was often located in a very specific part of town, away from everyone else. executioners frequently lived on the edges of communities, sometimes literally. Their houses might stand near city walls or beyond the main residential districts. Not because they preferred a quiet commute, because many towns didn't particularly want them nearby. People feared them. Not necessarily because they thought the executioner would attack them. The fear was stranger than that. Many medieval Europeans believed executioners carried a kind of social contamination. Touching death for a living made a person suspicious. Handling corpses made a person suspicious. Being associated with punishment made a person suspicious. The logic was, admittedly, a little strange. The executioner was carrying out the law. The town hired him. The authorities paid him. Yet many of those same people wanted nothing to do with him afterward. Human beings have always possessed an impressive ability to create contradictions. The medieval period was no exception. Now, imagine our executioner arriving at the marketplace. He needs bread, maybe some vegetables, possibly a new pair of gloves. Execution work was not especially kind to gloves. Unfortunately, many merchants don't want direct contact with him. Some refuse to shake his hand. Some refuse to stand too close. In certain places, executioners received goods through unusual arrangements. Products might be placed on a counter, money placed separately, physical contact minimized. The entire transaction conducted as if everyone involved were participating in an extremely awkward dance, one that nobody enjoyed. And yet, despite this social isolation, executioners occasionally possessed surprising privileges, because towns still needed them. A skilled executioner wasn't easy to replace. You couldn't simply post a notice saying, "Wanted, experienced beheader, must work weekends." The talent pool was limited, very limited. A good executioner mattered, particularly when dealing with nobles. If a nobleman was sentenced to death, there was an expectation that the process would be efficient. Nobody wanted an executioner having an off day. That tended to create public relations issues. As a result, skilled executioners could earn respectable incomes. Some received tax exemptions. Some enjoyed legal protections. Some accumulated significant wealth, which created one of history's more awkward social situations. People who refused to eat with the executioner might still be jealous of his salary. Imagine being simultaneously excluded and financially successful. It's a very confusing combination. Let's float over to another strange aspect of executioner life: marriage. Because eventually, our executioner needs companionship, like everyone else. Unfortunately, finding a spouse presented challenges. Many families didn't want their daughters marrying an executioner, which, from their perspective, made sense. The profession carried stigma, social isolation, uncertainty. A daughter marrying an executioner might inherit the same social problems. And so executioners often married within a relatively small circle. Sometimes they married daughters of other executioners. Sometimes daughters of gravediggers. Sometimes members of occupations that society already viewed with suspicion. Entire networks of marginal professions occasionally became connected through marriage. A sort of medieval social club nobody actually wanted membership in. Children inherited the consequences. which feels particularly unfair. Imagine being 8 years old and discovering your career options have already narrowed because of your father's job. Many executioner families became dynasties. Generation after generation entered the profession, not always because they wanted to, because opportunities elsewhere were limited. If society already treated you as an outsider, remaining within the family profession often became the practical choice. And so executioner surnames sometimes appeared repeatedly across centuries, father to son.
Then son to grandson. An occupation passed down like a family heirloom, albeit a rather unsettling one. Now, here's something surprisingly odd. People who avoided executioners during daily life occasionally sought them out for medical advice. Yes, medical advice. Because medieval executioners possessed knowledge of the human body. A disturbing amount of knowledge, actually. Years of handling injuries, corpses, and physical punishment gave them practical anatomical experience, far more than many ordinary citizens possessed. Some executioners developed reputations as healers. People visited them for treatments, ointments, bone setting, minor medical procedures. It's one of those historical details that sounds completely invented. The town refuses to invite you to social gatherings, but secretly asks you to look at a painful shoulder injury. Human beings are wonderfully inconsistent. The executioner might spend the morning removing a dead animal from a roadside, the afternoon treating someone's broken arm, and the evening being avoided by the very people he helped. A strange existence, yet in many ways a very human one. Because beneath all the myths, executioners worried about ordinary things. Money, family, health, old age, the future. The same concerns shared by nearly everyone else. They simply carried those concerns while living on the edge of society, neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, needed but disliked, visible yet isolated. And as the sun sets over a medieval town, our executioner returns home. The marketplace is quieter now. The crowds have thinned. The day's work is finished. Or at least, mostly finished. Tomorrow may bring another execution. Or perhaps it won't. Tomorrow may involve cleaning streets, or transporting prisoners, or repairing equipment, or treating a customer's injured hand. Life as an executioner was rarely predictable. But one thing remained constant. When the beheadings were over, life went on. The crowd forgot. The officials moved on. The condemned disappeared into history. And the executioner woke up the next morning and went back to work. Because even one of the most feared men in medieval Europe still had bills to pay. And unfortunately, nobody in the Middle Ages accepted payment in dramatic reputation alone. Learning the family business nobody wanted. As we continue our slow journey through the peculiar world of medieval executioners, let's talk about something that most children probably never dreamed of becoming when they grew up. An executioner. Because unlike blacksmiths, bakers, merchants, or farmers, executioners occupied a profession that almost nobody actively chose. At least, not in the way we think about choosing careers today. There was no medieval career fair, no helpful village counselor asking about strengths and interests.
No personality quiz suggesting that because you enjoyed working with your hands and possessed good upper body strength, you might be an excellent candidate for public executions. Life was generally less flexible than that. Instead, many executioners entered the profession through family connections. Their fathers had done the job. Sometimes their grandfathers had done the job. Occasionally, the profession stretched back several generations, which meant that somewhere along the line, an unfortunate ancestor had become the family founder of a career path nobody else particularly wanted. And once that happened, leaving the profession could be difficult. Not because executioners lacked other abilities. Quite the opposite. Many possessed practical skills that could have transferred to other trades. The problem was reputation. People remembered. People talked. And medieval
communities excelled at remembering things for extremely long periods of time, particularly if those things involved social status. A young man born into an executioner family might decide he wanted to become a merchant, or a craftsman, or a farmer. Unfortunately, potential customers and employers might have other ideas. His surname carried baggage. His family carried baggage. The profession carried baggage. A great deal of baggage. Enough baggage to fill several medieval wagons. And so, many sons followed their fathers into the trade. Not necessarily out of enthusiasm, but because alternatives were limited. Now, before we go any further, we should clear up a common misconception. Executioners were not simply large men swinging axes around at random. At least the successful ones weren't. The job required skill. An uncomfortable skill, certainly. But skill nonetheless. A good executioner needed accuracy, strength, composure, and perhaps most importantly, consistency. This was not a profession that rewarded improvisation. Imagine the pressure. A large crowd watches. Local officials watch. Sometimes nobility watches. Everyone expects competence. The condemned individual certainly hopes for competence, for fairly obvious reasons. One poorly executed execution could damage a man's reputation for years. And in some cases, authorities fined executioners for mistakes, which feels like adding professional embarrassment to an already stressful workday. Imagine receiving negative performance reviews because of a badly executed execution. A sentence that sounds ridiculous. Yet, historically speaking, it happened. So training mattered.
Young apprentices learned techniques. They observed experienced executioners. They practiced handling equipment. They learned legal procedures. They learned how different punishments were carried out. It was essentially vocational training, just an unusually grim version. While other apprentices learned baking or metalworking, future executioners learned how to perform one of society's least popular, but most necessary functions. Not exactly the same atmosphere. Now, let's drift gently toward another strange aspect of executioner life. Their relationship with fear. Because most people feared executioners, but executioners themselves often lived surprisingly ordinary lives. History has a habit of turning certain professions into legends. Executioners became mysterious figures, dark figures, almost mythical figures. Yet when you examine their daily existence, much of it looks remarkably normal.
They ate meals, raised children, argued with spouses, paid bills, complained about work, probably complained about weather. Human beings have been complaining about weather since the invention of weather. And executioners were no exception. The difference was that most professions did not carry such overwhelming social symbolism. The baker made bread. The blacksmith made tools. The executioner represented punishment itself, authority itself, mortality itself. People projected enormous meaning onto the profession, whether the individual executioner wanted that attention or not. And many probably did not. Because being feared sounds exciting for approximately 5 minutes. After that, it becomes inconvenient. Very inconvenient. Particularly when trying to buy vegetables. Let's imagine our executioner visiting a tavern. Theoretically, a simple activity. A place to eat, drink, relax, talk with other people. Except it wasn't always simple. Some taverns welcomed executioners. Others preferred not to. Some customers moved away when an executioner entered. Others stared. Others became uncomfortable. The entire atmosphere changed, which must have been exhausting. Imagine walking into a room and immediately becoming the most discussed person present. Every single time. No matter what mood you're in. No matter how tired you are. No matter how much you'd prefer to quietly enjoy your dinner, you become the conversation. Again. And again. And again. Now, occasionally, this notoriety worked in the executioner's favor. Some people found the profession fascinating. Stories circulated. Rumors spread. Executioners knew things. They witnessed important events. They interacted with criminals, nobles, judges, and officials. Sometimes they became sources of information. And medieval people enjoyed gossip every bit as much as modern people do. Possibly more. If a local noble had been arrested, if a scandal had emerged, if an unusual punishment was scheduled, people wanted details. The executioner often possessed them. Whether he wanted to share them was another matter. But information carries value. And in an age before newspapers, reliable information could be surprisingly powerful. Now, here's something many people don't realize. Executioners frequently owned some very valuable possessions. Not because the profession itself required luxury, because certain legal traditions granted them unusual rights. In some regions, executioners could claim specific items from executed criminals. Clothing, personal belongings, equipment, sometimes portions of fines, sometimes other forms of compensation. The exact arrangements varied from place to place, but the result could be financially beneficial, which created another ironic situation. The man many citizens refused to socialize with might quietly possess a healthier bank account than they did. History enjoys irony. Executioner history enjoys it even more. And yet, wealth could not solve every problem. Money helps, certainly, but money cannot buy acceptance. It cannot erase reputation. It cannot instantly change social attitudes. A wealthy executioner could still be lonely. A successful executioner
could still be isolated. A respected professional could still be excluded from community life. These contradictions followed many executioners throughout their careers. Now let's talk about clothing. Because executioners in popular culture often appear dressed entirely in black. Hoods, masks, dark, mysterious outfits, the complete medieval villain package. Reality was usually less dramatic. Many executioners dressed much like other working professionals. Practical clothing, durable clothing, ordinary clothing. The famous black hood often belongs more to modern imagination than historical reality, which is slightly disappointing. History occasionally refuses to cooperate with our favorite visual stereotypes. Instead, many executioners looked surprisingly normal. If you passed one in the street, you might not immediately recognize his profession. At least until someone else crossed the street to avoid him.
That might serve as a clue. As evening settles once again over our medieval town, the executioner returns home. His children may already be asleep. His spouse may be waiting. The city grows quieter. The marketplace closes. The day's gossip slows. And for a few hours, he enjoys the same thing everyone else wants. Peace. A little rest. A little distance from work. Because despite the unusual nature of his profession, he remained human. Not a monster. Not a legend. Not a symbol. Just a man performing a difficult job in a society that simultaneously depended upon him and wanted him to disappear. A contradiction he carried every day of his life.
And tomorrow, when the sun rises over the town once more, he will wake up and do it all again. Not because he enjoys being feared, not because he enjoys being isolated, but because someone has to do the work. And in medieval Europe, that someone was often the executioner. A man whose busiest moments became history, and whose ordinary moments were quietly forgotten.
The executioner who somehow became your doctor. As night continues drifting gently across medieval Europe, let's move into one of the strangest chapters in the life of an executioner. And that is the chapter where people spent years avoiding him, only to show up at his door asking for medical help. Which sounds completely backwards, because it was. But medieval history has a special talent for producing situations that seem entirely unreasonable until you remember that nobody involved had access to modern medicine. Once you remember that detail, things begin making a little more sense. Not a lot more sense. Just enough. Now, imagine you've spent most of your life treating the executioner like a walking bad omen. You avoid sitting near him. You avoid shaking his hand. You avoid inviting him to family gatherings. If he enters a tavern, you suddenly become very interested in the opposite side of the room. Then, one day, your shoulder stops working properly, or your arm gets injured. Or your knee starts making alarming noises every time you stand up. Suddenly, your principles become flexible. Very flexible. And before long, you're knocking on the executioner's door. Because despite their reputation, many executioners possessed practical knowledge about the human body. A surprising amount of practical knowledge.
far more than the average villager, possibly more than some officially trained medical practitioners, which is both fascinating and mildly concerning. You see, executioners spent years dealing with injuries, broken bones, damaged joints, physical trauma, human anatomy. They observed things. They learned things. And over time, many accumulated genuine medical experience. Not modern medical experience.
Certainly not. But practical experience. The sort that develops when someone repeatedly encounters physical injuries for decades. As a result, executioners occasionally became unofficial healers, which remains one of history's most ironic career developments. The man society treats as untouchable gradually becomes someone people seek out for help. Human beings are wonderfully inconsistent, and medieval people were very much human beings. Now, before we continue, it's important to understand that medieval medicine was already an unusual field. Doctors existed, surgeons existed, apothecaries existed, but medical knowledge varied dramatically. Some treatments worked, some treatments accomplished nothing, and some treatments probably made everything worse. Yet people still needed care.
So they consulted whoever seemed knowledgeable, including executioners, especially executioners. Because unlike many scholars, executioners possessed direct experience with anatomy. Again, not the most cheerful way to gain expertise, but expertise nonetheless. Imagine a farmer arriving at an executioner's house. His wrist hurts. He cannot grip tools properly. Work has become difficult. The executioner examines the injury, offers advice, perhaps applies a treatment, perhaps resets a joint, perhaps recommends rest. Though recommending rest to a medieval laborer was somewhat like recommending a vacation to someone who couldn't afford one. Technically helpful, not always practical. Still, people came, again and again, and over time, certain executioners developed strong reputations as healers, a reputation that existed alongside their far less pleasant professional reputation. The result was socially confusing. People feared them, needed them, avoided them, trusted them, sometimes all at once, which must have been exhausting. Imagine living in a world where half the town refuses to eat dinner with you, and the other half wants your medical advice. Not exactly a straightforward social situation. Now, let's drift over to another curious detail. Executioners often collected unusual medical ingredients. And when I say unusual, I mean extremely unusual. Medieval medicine loved strange ingredients. Absolutely loved them. Animal parts, herbs, minerals, powders, oils, mixtures of uncertain purpose. The medical profession occasionally resembled an experimental cooking competition with very low safety standards. Executioners sometimes participated in this world. They prepared remedies, created ointments, mixed treatments, and sold them to customers. Some remedies probably provided genuine relief. Others probably succeeded primarily because patients wanted them to succeed. Which, to be fair, has influenced medical history more than people often realize. Belief can be surprisingly powerful, even when the treatment itself is questionable. Now, here's where things become even stranger.
certain medieval superstitions granted executioners almost mystical status.
Not respected mystical status, more like unsettling mystical status. People believed executioners possessed unusual powers. Not magic, exactly, but something close. A connection to death, a connection to punishment, a connection to forces ordinary people preferred not to think about. As a result, various folk beliefs emerged. Some individuals sought executioners for lucky charms. Others sought objects associated with executions. Some believed certain items carried protective properties, which sounds odd, because it was odd. But medieval Europe was full of beliefs that sound odd from a modern perspective. Future historians will almost certainly say the same thing about us. Every generation possesses ideas that seem perfectly reasonable at the time, until several centuries pass.
Then things become considerably less convincing. Now, imagine the executioner's position in all this. He understands that people fear him. He understands that people need him. He understands that rumors surround him. Yet he still has ordinary concerns. His roof leaks. His children need shoes. His equipment requires maintenance. The dog keeps getting into something it shouldn't. Normal life continues. And that's perhaps the most fascinating aspect of executioners. History often transforms them into symbols, yet they spent most of their time dealing with practical problems. The same practical problems everyone else faced.
Only with considerably fewer dinner invitations. Let's talk for a moment about aging. Because every executioner eventually grows older. And aging presents challenges in any profession, particularly professions requiring physical skill. Strength declines. Vision changes. Reflexes slow. The body becomes less cooperative. An executioner approaching old age faces an uncomfortable reality. His profession depends upon precision. Precision becomes harder with age. Not impossible, just harder. Some retired. Some reduced their responsibilities. Some relied increasingly on sons or apprentices. Others continued working longer than they probably should have, a tradition shared by workers in nearly every historical period. Humans are remarkably reluctant to stop doing jobs they've performed for decades, even when their knees strongly disagree. As retirement approaches, another question emerges. What exactly happens to a retired executioner? Does society suddenly welcome him? Not usually. The reputation remains. The history remains. People remember. Medieval communities had exceptionally long memories, particularly regarding social status. A retired executioner often remained an executioner in the eyes of the town. The profession followed him, even after the work stopped, which feels somewhat unfair. But history rarely distributes fairness evenly.
Still, some managed comfortable lives. Some accumulated wealth. Some owned property. Some successfully passed businesses and responsibilities to younger generations. Life after execution work existed. It simply remained shaped by everything that came before. And as another evening settles across the medieval town, our executioner sits quietly at home, perhaps reviewing accounts, perhaps speaking with family, perhaps enjoying a rare moment of peace,
Outside, neighbors continue living their lives. Most will never fully understand him. Some will never try. Yet tomorrow, if they need help, if they need expertise, if they need services nobody else can provide, they know exactly where to find him. The same man they spent years avoiding. Because medieval society may not have liked executioners, but it certainly depended on them. And sometimes, dependence creates relationships far stranger than friendship. A lesson history teaches again and again, in ways both fascinating and deeply awkward. And few professions embodied that awkwardness better than the medieval executioner.
Born into the profession nobody wanted. As we continue our slow wander through medieval Europe, let's leave the executioner himself for a moment and step quietly into his household. Because while the executioner carried the burden of his profession, he was rarely the only person affected by it. His family carried it too. His wife carried it, his children carried it, and sometimes his grandchildren carried it. In fact, one of the strangest things about medieval executioners is that many of them never truly chose the profession at all. They inherited it. Not the way someone might inherit a farm, or a bakery, or a respectable collection of sheep. They inherited a reputation. And unfortunately, reputations are often much harder to get rid of than sheep. A sheep can wander away. A reputation tends to follow you for years.
You're 8 years old. You spend your days doing ordinary childhood things. Running around, exploring, getting into trouble, as children have done throughout all of human history. Yet from an early age, you begin noticing something. People treat your family differently. Other children sometimes avoid you. Certain parents seem uncomfortable. Some neighbors remain distant. You don't fully understand why. You simply know that something feels different. And as you grow older, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. Because medieval society loved categories. People belonged somewhere. And once society placed you into a category, escaping it could be difficult. Executioner families occupied a category all their own, a category that very few people wanted to join. Now let's talk about school, or at least whatever educational opportunities existed in a particular place and time. A young executioner's son might learn practical skills from his father: household management, equipment maintenance, record keeping, professional techniques, all the things necessary to continue the family trade. Because sooner or later, reality arrived. And reality often looked like this. Other professions weren't interested. Not necessarily because the child lacked ability, because the family name carried a certain reputation. A reputation attached to death, punishment. Even though respectable society showed up in large numbers whenever an execution occurred. Another one of history's favorite contradictions. People avoided executioners, yet watched their work. People feared executioners, yet depended on them. People looked down on executioners, yet needed them desperately. Human beings can be wonderfully inconsistent, and medieval Europeans practiced inconsistency at a very high level. Now, imagine reaching adulthood. Perhaps you're the daughter of an executioner.
life presents another challenge: marriage. Because marriage in medieval society wasn't simply a personal decision. It involved families, status, reputation, connections, and executioner family. Not because of personality, not because of appearance, not because of character, because of occupation, or rather, because of family occupation, which created a frustrating situation. A perfectly decent young woman might find herself excluded from certain social circles simply because of her father's profession. A profession she never chose, a profession she never practiced, yet one that shaped her future anyway. History can be remarkably unfair that way. So executioner families often married within a relatively small network. Executioners married the daughters of executioners. Their children married into other marginal professions: gravediggers, animal skinners, workers associated with death, blood, or activities respectable society preferred to keep at arm's length. But communities with their own connections, their own relationships, their own traditions. People who understood one another because they shared similar experiences. And honestly, that makes sense. When society keeps its distance, people naturally seek others who understand their situation. Humans have always done this. Now, let's imagine an executioner's household on an ordinary evening. No execution scheduled tomorrow, no major event approaching, just a normal evening. The family sits together, dinner is served, children talk about their day, parents discuss finances, someone complains about work, someone else complains about weather. Again, humans have been complaining about weather since the dawn of civilization because it is ordinary. That is perhaps the most important thing to remember. Executioners were not mysterious creatures lurking in dark corners of society. They were families, households, parents, children, neighbors, people. The profession was unusual. The people were not. Yet medieval society often struggled to separate those two ideas. The job became the identity. And once that happened, escaping the identity became difficult. Very difficult. Now, let's float gently over to another aspect of family life: inheritance. Because skills, connections, all of these passed from one generation to the next. Executioner families inherited something unusual. Not only property, not only skills, they inherited necessity. The town needed an executioner. The father grows older. Eventually, someone must replace him. The son understands this. The community understands this. Everyone understands this. Whether anyone likes it is another matter. So, generation after generation continued. Father teaches son. Son teaches grandson. The profession survives. And once a family occupies that role, society often expects them to continue occupying it for centuries. In some regions, certain executioner dynasties became surprisingly famous. Not famous in the way kings became famous, more like infamous. Local authorities knew them. Neighboring towns knew them. Officials recommended them. When a skilled executioner was needed, people knew which family to contact, which is a very unusual form of professional reputation.
Imagine your family becoming known across an entire region for being exceptionally good at something nobody wants to discuss. That was essentially the situation. Now, let's consider the emotional side of all this, because historical records often focus on practical matters, payments, appointments.
Children worried about parents. Families experienced pride, embarrassment, frustration, love. Exactly the same emotional landscape found in every other household. An executioner's wife might worry about her husband's safety. An executioner's son might wonder whether a different future is possible. An executioner's daughter might hope people see her as more than her family name. These concerns rarely appear in official records, but they almost certainly existed, because people remain people, regardless of profession, regardless of century, regardless of social status. And perhaps that is why executioner history feels strangely human once you look beyond the stereotypes. At first glance, executioners appear unusual, almost exotic.
Families trying to survive. Parents planning for the future. Children searching for opportunity. People navigating circumstances they didn't entirely choose. A story as old as history itself. And as the evening grows late, another executioner's household settles into silence. The children sleep. The lamps burn low. The town outside grows quiet. Tomorrow will bring more responsibilities, more work, more challenges. But for now, there is peace, at least for a few hours. A small pocket of normal life inside one of medieval Europe's most unusual professions. And perhaps that normality is the most surprising thing of all. Because when the crowds went home and the public spectacle ended, executioners were not living inside history books. They were simply living their lives, one ordinary day at a time.